At the library I work at, we're taking on these monthly reading challenges where the fourth Monday of every month we meet and talk about a book that we've all read that falls under a given theme. So for January, the theme is to read a book with snow on the cover or a book that is set in wintertime. So I decided to pick up Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. A lot of it does take place in winter specifically, despite the novel jumping around in time. The conditions are unsparing, much like the cruelty of the characters themselves. A while back, I met a friend to celebrate his birthday and got to get to know his friends a little bit better as well, and ultimately the night kind of turned into us bar hopping and just talking about books the whole night. I mentioned that Blood Meridian was one of my favorite all-time books, and one of his friends mentioned that it was one of the worst books he had ever read. He cited Wuthering Heights as possibly his, all-time favorite novel. Not out of a desire to go into this novel with negative intentions, because I love Blood Meridian so much, and his favorite novel has to be bad. I did ultimately come out of this book with a great appreciation for it. Prior to reading this book, without having done any research on its contents, I had just sort of mentally lumped Wuthering Heights among the, costume romances, of which I have read none, but I have enjoyed many of the cinematic adaptations of these works. Little Women, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Far from the Madding Crowd. I am a big sucker for costume drama romance. And so I just thought, hey, her sister wrote Jane Eyre, which I also enjoyed the adaptation of. I bet that this is probably a lot like it, right? I was not prepared for just how vicious this novel truly is. Scandalous at the time of its publication. One critic review in particular stands out from Graham's Lady magazine. How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors. They write that as if they want me to not read this book. The verbal barbs the characters exchange truly do cut deep and draw blood. The novel is very tragic and follows two families over the course of 2 generations that seem mutually bound for destruction, all of that somehow tracing back to the character of Heathcliff, who is easily the most interesting in the novel. Heathcliff is found by Mr. Earnshaw, who owns the estate at Wuthering Heights. The other family in the novel are the Lintons, who live at Thrushcross Grange. They're kind of like neighbors, but they're separated by at least 2 miles. So one day Mr. Earnshaw finds this boy on the side of the road and inducts him into the family. He ends up becoming his favorite, but his wild countenance and just sort of rough demeanor really rubs the other members of the family the wrong way. Save for Catherine Earnshaw, the daughter of the household, who, though initially having a distaste for the boy, warms to him soon enough and they become fast friends, inseparable, really. The eldest son, Hindley, and Mrs. Earnshaw really hate Heathcliff. They call the boy Heathcliff in reference to one of Mrs. Earnshaw's children who did not make it. So it almost seems as though the boy from the get-go has this sort of curse upon him. I really like the ambiguity of where Heathcliff's cruel nature comes from. Part of you wants to believe it could have been his rough upbringing that so marked him, but it also partly has to have been his mistreatment at the hands of Hindley, who is just so terrible to Heathcliff. Heathcliff is a character that kind of earns our sympathy, right? He's considered to be something of an outsider. He's not really an Earnshaw, he just sort of lives with them. Later on in the novel, his vehemence really does rear its head and causes you to maybe almost walk that sympathy back. This is being recounted to us as a story told to a tenant, Mr. Lockwood, by one of the housekeepers, Ellen Dean, who has lived through these 2 generations and seen how these houses have quarreled and fallen apart over the years. Critics have speculated a lot on the reliability of our narrator, Nellie, and whether or not her account of events is exactly to be trusted. There are old essays where people are like, the true villain of Wuthering Heights is actually Ellen Dean. It's good to know that it is not simply our current media landscape that has allowed such asinine takes to gain popular currency. I don't really think that Emily Bronte's intent was for us to fundamentally doubt everything we're hearing. It is an interesting comment on the nature of memory, and in particular, memory tinged by death, and how those memories have a particular potency. Because a lot of the events that Ellen Dean is accounting relate to people getting sick and dying and the effects of those things, and the grief and the mourning that comes with all of that. And that would be a theme that falls well in line with the life that Emily Bronte lived. From a very young age, she had seen most of the adult female figures in her life die, and she herself passed away not soon after the publication of this very novel from disease. If anything, this framing device is really interesting to me because it demands of the reader that we create the meaning of the story from its contour. And yeah, if you want to explore this dimension of the framing, there is evidence that Ellen Dean is very partial. There are points where she is called out for favoring one party over another, and there is something of a discrepancy that I picked up as relates to the start of the novel that you only discover at the end. The character, Mr. Lockwood, is visiting the Heights during a snowstorm, and no one will let him find shelter in any of their rooms, except for one of the housekeepers named Zilla, who walks him up to Catherine Earnshaw's old room, where he has something of a gothic dream of her memory after having read her diary, which has been written in the margins of this Bible, which already tints the story in something of a blasphemous tone. There does seem to be a disdain for overly religious types, like the housekeeper Joseph, who speaks in this Yorkshire dialect, which is almost unintelligible for most of the novel. There's one point where Joseph is like trying to say something to Catherine. Catherine just responds to him, almost disregarding everything he said, and is like, "Where's Heathcliff, you ass?" So Lockwood is able to actually get some sleep at this house due to the kindness of Zilla, the housekeeper. Later on in the novel, Ellen Dean describes Zilla as really self-centered and would never betray her master's wishes. I felt that to be something of a contradiction, and an interesting one. It really does show Ellen Dean has impressions of other people that probably tint how we are hearing about them. Because this story is being told to us from the vantage point of someone standing very near its end, we already know how most of the beats are going to go. It is the manner in which they transpire that I think makes the book compelling. Not only that, but it is just wonderfully, wonderfully written. I learned a lot of new words reading this book, and it kind of rewrote my mind to think in this old-fashioned dialect, which was fun to revel in. While I wouldn't say it was an incredibly difficult book to read, it did evoke the sensation I had when I was reading Great Expectations in high school, that sort of writing style, which I did not enjoy at the time. I found it kind of languid. The more old-fashioned dialect really makes it a savory read, especially when Bronte gets on a streak where she just knows what she's put into paper is pure poetry. Incredible stuff. And she did publish poetry in her lifetime. That's one of the only other notable works from her, aside from this, is a collection of poetry between her and her sisters. However, there is an unintentionally hilarious dimension of this novel that comes from its very dialect. Oh my god. Okay, yeah, hold on, I found it. The use of the word ejaculated and ejaculation, basically meaning I'm calling out, I'm ejaculating. The funniest one I found to be this sentence on page 120. "Still my companion paced to and fro, his head bent on his breast and perfectly silent, unless a groan or a bitter ejaculation forced itself out at intervals." Hey man, I've been there. That's just maybe something of a remnant of the vernacular at the time that didn't necessarily hold up, but still elicited entertainment value. The most interesting part of the novel, for me, is Heathcliff himself. His motivations and how his actions both positively and negatively impact the family, and just how single-minded he is. Heathcliff is spurned not only due to his poor treatment as sort of an outsider among the Earnshaws. His best friend and love of his life, Catherine Earnshaw, is married off to Edgar Linton, who Heathcliff hates. There is something of a commentary on class permeating this novel as well, the Lintons seeming far better off than the Earnshaws, and thus their fortune and estate is sought after, and it becomes a part of Heathcliff's revenge to acquire his estate. It is very interesting too that Heathcliff and Catherine are propped up as the romantic leads, I guess, in this novel, because both of them do not work to placate the whims of others at all. they are very selfish characters. Their pursuit of their own desires stubbornly, like to the point where they will engage in violence, is what creates this incredible tension. The Lintons, having been a little more pampered, the way in which they speak is more polite and refined. Their health is also comparatively not as robust. It is the way in which Catherine kind of reforms from her wild ways after getting bitten by the Linton's dog and having to stay to recover with them for a couple of weeks that changes her nature, sort of, and causes this tension between her and Heathcliff, because now she has this fondness for the Lintons and seems to at least be trying to maintain an exterior of refinement in line with their lifestyle. Not only does Heathcliff kind of feel as if Catherine is not simply just like betraying him by having an allegiance with the Lintons or even a fondness or romantic fondness for Edgar Linton, he also, more than that, more than a betrayal of himself, feels as if Catherine is betraying her own nature. There's a really poignant monologue where she explains why it is that she could not marry Heathcliff and will marry Edgar, but how Heathcliff will always be her foremost love. Class factoring back into her decision to marry Edgar, she says at one point that I am Heathcliff, that she will always love him because he is simply more herself than she is, which is such an interesting way to frame their dynamic. Not so much that they care for each other, not in the sense of, opposites attract, that they resemble each other and so love each other more for that, which I guess feeds into their selfish natures. There's this really nasty moment where Catherine, trying to save face in front of the Lintons, pinches Ellen Dean, and she's seen doing this by Edgar, and he becomes aware of just how nasty she is, but he turns around and supports her nonetheless and falls all the deeper in love with her. He has already been so smitten that he's willing to overlook her bad nature. The moment that Catherine sets her sights on Edgar, Heathcliff just leaves to try to become a gentleman. And so he returns later in life, this sort of enigmatic figure. We're not exactly sure how it is that he went about refining himself or achieving his fortune in the world. All that really truly matters is his effect on this family, giving Hindley, his older brother, something of a gambling problem, and making him indebted to him and forcing him to leave him the estate after he dies. Heathcliff so spites Hindley that there's a moment earlier on in the novel where Hindley's son Hareton falls over this ledge and Heathcliff accidentally catches him. Heathcliff, having saved Hareton's life, quote, expressed plainer than words could do the intensest anguish at having made himself the instrument of thwarting his own revenge. He actually regrets having saved his nephew's life because it would have so hurt Hindley. Heathcliff is sort of, at points, characterized as something of an anti-hero. Someone who does things that are good, saving Hareton, but he is still single-mindedly in pursuit of Catherine and in destabilizing the lives of the Lintons for taking her from him. There's this awesome moment where he's been trying to wrestle his way back into their lives, and Catherine is kind of pitted in the middle. Edgar saying like he will have nothing to do with Heathcliff, and Heathcliff just goads him on and keeps lobbing this verbal abuse upon Edgar. This otherwise kind of mild-natured guy gets up and just punches Heathcliff in the fucking throat. Edgar, I found, despite his flaws, maybe one of the more sympathetic characters in the novel, and to see his emotions actually get the better of him, one of the most gratifying moments in the whole book. One of the more melodramatic beats, and there are actually quite a lot of them throughout Wuthering Heights. I feel it could be easily classified as a melodrama. After this fight ensues, Catherine becomes ill and then dies, having given birth to her daughter that they name Cathy prior to her passing. Catherine being unable to maintain a friendship with Heathcliff is sort of the cause for her death. Stepping away from the novel and kind of viewing the grand scope of it, I do feel as if that kind of came across as a bit obvious. Heathcliff confronts Cathy prior to her death, not because she has spurned him, but because she has spurned herself. He could never forgive her. The mirroring of Catherine and Heathcliff kind of just rebounds upon itself. And so when she does die, his life becomes a living hell. Another really startling moment and evidence of Heathcliff's almost animalistic, emotional ways. Waiting outside of Thrushcross Grange, he has been so motionless that these birds have actually started to build a nest like 3 feet away from him. And then in his grief, he thrashes bashes his head against the trunk of a tree and gets blood everywhere. The violent eruptions of emotion from Heathcliff really do catch you off guard. The second half of the novel has something of an interesting mirror to the first. Instead of following Catherine Linton, we follow her daughter Cathy, and how her romantic feelings for someone living on the neighboring estate causes the two households to erupt in conflict once again. Heathcliff marries Edgar's sister Isabella, and after a tumultuous falling out, she raises their son until her premature death. Again, the Lintons do have a weaker constitution than the Earnshaws. It is emphasized a lot. The scene of their falling out, Heathcliff and Isabella's, is really quite dramatic. Isabella almost plays a passive party to an attempt on Heathcliff's life by Hindley, who tries to shoot him, and then Heathcliff just beats the shit out of Hindley. He throws a knife at Isabella as she's about to leave. They're not fucking around when they're threatening to kill each other, which they do often. Heathcliff threatens to slit Edgar's throat and drink his blood. It's so metal, man. Cathy begins to develop feelings for Heathcliff's son, Linton Heathcliff. Though it is in direct reference to her family name, I really feel as if the motivation is probably just to spite Heathcliff that his progeny cannot escape the Linton name. This part of the novel, which almost sort of resembles like Romeo and Juliet, casting Linton and Cathy as the star-crossed lovers whose families will not let them be with one another, that very force actually intensifies their love. That was a really frustrating part of the book, not because it was poorly written or not because these machinations are incoherent. This makes too much sense. I've seen way too many people in my own life wreak damage upon the other people in their life because of their romantic pursuits. That's why it was fucking frustrating. It's because it was real, man. Damn. The second half of Wuthering Heights did feel, at least in comparison to its first half, as if this conclusion is already precluded. We know Heathcliff's scheme is to get Linton to marry Cathy so that he can acquire Edgar's estate upon his death. And while all of that tracks and feeds into the overall themes of vengeance, it did start to wear on me a little bit, where Heathcliff actually abducts Ellen Dean and Cathy and forces Cathy to marry Linton, who is dying. That, to me, impressed as rather outlandish. This almost Machiavellian, grandiose act of villainy was just a little too ridiculous. Linton Heathcliff himself is one of the sadder characters. His whole life has just been as this pawn in this game orchestrated by a vengeful old man. His sickliness affects his better nature, and there's one point where he says to Cathy, if I could be a better person, I would be, but I've just been sort of conditioned to be this spiteful person. When Heathcliff is carrying out the final act of his vengeance, Linton very pathetically goes along with this ploy, even though he is dying. This guy has no options. Though he does have something of an authentic love with Cathy, there's a certain point where all of the characters, including her, lose sympathy for him, all while he's hacking up blood. Just this absolutely pitiable condition. I felt really bad for him, even though he's kind of a piece of shit too. There's a point where he mocks Hareton for being illiterate, which is another thing that Heathcliff has made by design. Because if Hareton was more of a gentleman, he might have a better chance at eloping with Cathy. Despite my qualms with the melodramatic dimension of the penultimate act of Wuthering Heights, the final stretch of this book is absolutely incredible. For so much of this novel, there's this bitterness, there's this lack of true romance. Owning the properties of both households, his daughter-in-law Cathy is now his servant at the estate, his son Linton having passed away due to his illness. Heathcliff has gotten everything he desires. Hareton, his nephew, and Cathy fall in love. Despite the two of them having a rough start, one that even involves violence, she warms to him and wants to teach him how to read, to elevate him from his condition of drudgery. The two of them developing this warmth for each other takes Heathcliff kind of off guard, and he doesn't want to disrupt it either. And then after that, he spontaneously seems overcome with joy. This is one of the most bitter and contemptuous and unhappy characters you'll ever come across, and to see him just elated, his disposition of animalistic wrath just washing away, melting almost. with the spring. It is somewhat hinted at that he is actually seeing Catherine's ghost. Maybe it is the true love of Cathy and Hareton having survived under Heathcliff that causes her to come back. I'm not sure exactly the motivation. I like that it's sort of ambiguous, but all of a sudden he's just elated. And we get this beautiful, beautiful monologue that lasts, I feel, almost 3-4 pages, where Heathcliff seems to be content, in a way. As much as Heathcliff can be. He's not really forgiven by Cathy, but he finds solace somehow in the captivating ghost of Catherine. He's so captivated, he dies from not having eaten for days and days on end. He says he would have eaten if he was not so in rapture with her image returning to him. It's really beautiful, and it's this Gothic element punctuating the very end of this novel, giving it this supernatural, otherworldly, kind of death-defying quality. A more profound statement than simply the fact that vengeance begets vengeance. It is more so the captivating memory of love, so powerful that it would cause a character to reject life, sheerly out of the rapture of it, for even the memory of love, which is no longer tangible. I thought that that was really moving. Hard not to feel swept up in the emotions of this final stretch of chapters. I really did get a lot out of Wuthering Heights. It does have this classic quality. A lot of critics have noted that the manner of the characters, the way they're drawn, almost makes them feel like archetypal, like they're larger than life. And I would agree. Despite the story itself suffering due to its emphasis on character and thus events sort of feeling more melodramatic, it was really worth the trudge of misery that you had to read through in order to get to that point. It certainly didn't help that not only was I reading this during the winter time when everything is just so dour, but I actually also got sick while reading this book. I very much felt an emotional parallel to at least the setting and some of the events in the novel while reading it. I wouldn't say it was better than Blood Meridian, throwing a little bit of shade at you, Ethan. I wish that Emily Bronte had lived longer to have produced more works. Also sad that, from the sound of it, there hasn't really been a worthy adaptation of this novel, at least in cinematic form. All of them either sort of get events wrong, or if they get all of the events, and it seems to be an all-encompassing retelling of Wuthering Heights, that there are other problems that these adaptations have that go beyond just being faithful. So hopefully someone down the line actually does get Wuthering Heights correctly. It is some consolation, at least, that Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights, one of the greatest songs of all time, does capture the tragic and gothic romance at the core of this beautiful novel, probably better than any film adaptation ever will.